What has happened as a result of 9/11? Let's go back before 9/11, first thought. If we pay attention, we will know something about the motive for 9/11 and the plan that was laid out before 9/11. Very famously, the Project for a New American Century, comprised of so-called neocons.
They were referred to in the circles in which I moved when I was briefing at the top intelligence and policy levels. They were referred to as the crazies. The crazies. I mean, you talk about the crazies, everyone knew who they were.
This is one of their blueprints, published in 2000 by the extreme right-wing group Project for a New American Century. The US military will fight multiple simultaneous wars as the cavalry on the new American frontier.
These people laid out a plan in the aftermath of the fall of the Soviet Union.
The fall of the Soviet Union left the United States as the sole superpower in the world. The Wolfowitz Doctrine stated, "We must maintain the mechanism for deterring potential competitors from even aspiring to a larger regional or global role."
You see, as the Cold War drew to an end, we saw the possibilities of a new order in which nations work together.
They argued that America found itself now in a unique position. In the fall of the Berlin Wall and the fall of the Soviet Empire, they argued that America should take advantage of this position, that it should achieve a goal of full spectrum dominance. Full spectrum dominance is an agenda to which America would maintain and create control over air, land, sea, and space. Total dominance of the seas, total dominance over the air, total dominance on the land, and even total dominance in space, with space-based nuclear weapons that could be launched anywhere, instantly. Well, they've achieved a lot of these goals to a great degree.
The U.S. had, by late 2007, gained a military presence, according to Stanford's Chalmers Johnson, in 151 of 192 UN member nations. In 2008, AFRICOM, based in Germany, was added as a sixth command responsible for growing U.S. military presence in Africa. SOUTHCOM, based in Miami, was reorganized in 2010 to increase U.S. military presence in Latin America with bases and surveillance systems, counter-drug and counter-insurgency programs targeting manifestations of radical populism, as seen in Venezuela. The Fourth Fleet was reactivated in 2008 for the first time since World War II. The Navy now has 10 carrier strike groups patrolling international waters.
America's Navy, a global force for good.
A full spectrum dominance of land, sea, air, space, and cyberspace.
Now, the way that they argued in the aftermath of the fall of the Soviet Empire to be able to achieve this goal is that we would have to carry out wars of aggression and occupations to be able to secure certain strategic advantages. Now keep in mind, this is all before 9/11. All of this is before 9/11. So what will we have to do? Well, we would have to secure the stupendous amount of energy reserves in the former Soviet republics, Turkmenistan and these areas. The former Soviet republics, or the Soviet republics in that region, have stupendous amounts of gas and natural reserves of oil as well.
While Afghanistan has minimal oil resources, to the north the former Soviet republics of Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan possess substantial oil and natural gas, which Russia exploited before the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1990.
Already we have American bases and troops in Uzbekistan, in Tajikistan, in Kyrgyzstan, and the Russians clearly are very nervous about this. China is another big player. China would like to extract a lot of this oil and gas and perhaps try and ship it to China. So I think, you know, in the future, we may well see a kind of three-way competition between Russia, China, and the United States for the resources of Central Asia.
U.S. military bases may now have replaced Soviet bases throughout Central Asia, but for American oil companies, a problem remains. where to run pipelines without passing through the territory of competing powers. With Russia to the north, Azerbaijan across the Caspian Sea to the west, Iran to the southwest, India to the southeast, and China to the east. Apparently, running pipelines through Afghanistan and Pakistan to the Indian Ocean seems to be the answer.
They would need to build a pipeline through Afghanistan. We didn't care about human rights or women's rights or any of that, come on. But the agenda was to take control of Afghanistan, to build that pipeline, and to control those energy reserves, because if we want to achieve full spectrum dominance, we need to be able to control those energy reserves. It gives us veto power over the world. If we control the oil, we control the gas reserves. Plus the stupendous amounts of mineral deposits in Afghanistan, which were well known back then as well. Afghanistan is a hugely important nation in terms of this full spectrum dominance agenda. Another key piece of the puzzle in this full spectrum dominance agenda was Iraq.
Before the war, Saddam controlled a country with a quarter of the world's oil production, containing more than 115 billion barrels of oil in reserve. Iraq was swimming in oil. It was a tempting target.
It's not accidental that the Bush administration sought the endless war project in the Middle East, because no region is more vital to the United States, meaning to the transnational corporations and to the banking elites and those who are really the captains of U.S. industry, the captains of the U.S. economy, than the Middle East, because that's where the oil is.
Second largest oil reserves, an important region. We wanted to build permanent military bases in the region. So how would we be able to affect this goal? Since we ended our friendly relationship with Saddam and he was no longer compliant and bending over for us as we expect of all of our puppets, we needed to take control of Iraq.
It has to do with Saddam Hussein's decision in November of 2000 to switch to the euro for all of his oil for food exports. He had been on the dollar for decades, and he decided to switch to the euro. Had he gone into full production of his oil capability, and had he continued to trade oil on the euro and not the dollar, this would have actually had a financial impact on the United States, in that central banks around the world would be more favorable towards the euro and less to the dollar.
There was a guy once named Saddam Hussein who said, you know, I'm kind of mad the United States bombing me, and Britain too, so I'm going to sell oil in the euros. Came out and said that in the fall of 2000. It's a big secret here in the United States.
With the mighty dollar's position as the world #1 suddenly under threat, did a ripple of fear go through the Bush administration? So according to this theory, Saddam Hussein signed his own death warrant.
We're not too worried about dictators as long as they're on our side, do what we tell them. Democracy is not the reason we went in there. The main reason is geostrategic regional dominance.
Does America have a problem dealing with tyrants? How stupid are we to think that? Who is Saddam Hussein? What, do we not know who Saddam Hussein was? We helped coddle Saddam Hussein and bring him to power. We protected him. We provided him with military power. We provided him with political support, economic support, agricultural support. Iraq was a favored nation trading ally. He was gassing Kurds, and we continued this relationship with him. He was torturing people, killing people. He was a tyrant from day one. We had no problem with that.
The crazies also include Donald Rumsfeld, seen here in Baghdad in 1986, warmly greeting Saddam Hussein, who was then being armed to the teeth by America and Britain.
In fact, we gave him the weapons to fight one of our wars against Iran.
We went to war in large part because of the concern that weapons of mass destruction in the hands of the Saddam Hussein regime, a regime that used such weapons, in particular nerve gas.
And was supplied by the United States and Britain with these weapons of mass destruction.
No, I don't believe that's accurate.
Well, yes, they were. Most of the weapons of mass destruction from Saddam Hussein weren't built by him. The machine tools and the ingredients for his biological weapons, they all came from other countries, many of them from this country and Britain.
I don't think that's right. I really think that
it's on the record in the Library of Congress. You'll find it there.
I think the premise of your question is wrong.
Mr. Fife had only to look up this congressional record of a U.S. Senate inquiry in 1992. It shows that the U.S. government approved the sale of biological weapons to Saddam Hussein. the suppliers were this company in Maryland and Porton Down in Britain.
Now, they said in their position paper, Rebuilding America's Defenses, in this agenda of taking over the world, they said very openly that in order to achieve these goals, we'd have to invade Afghanistan, we'd have to invade Iraq, there'd obviously be a huge loss of life. This would be very unpopular. The American people are too stupid to appreciate the wisdom of this plan, so we won't be able to get them to support this plan.
As synchronicities go, the most puzzling involved the terrorist attack on 9/11. Now, statistically speaking, some of these have to be coincidences, but others violate the odds outright. Over and over again, 9/11 appeared in everything from movies to comic books.
We know it's a war game scenario, and it has to do with airline counterterrorism. Why is it important enough to kill for?
Because it's no longer a game.
If some terrorist group wants to act out this scenario, why target you for assassination?
Depends on who your terrorists are.
The men who conceived of it in the first place. You're saying our government plans to commit a terrorist act against a domestic airline?
There you go. Indicting the entire government as usual. It's a faction. A small faction.
For what possible gain?
The Cold War's over, John. But with no clear enemy to stockpile against, the arms market's flat. But bring down a fully loaded 727 into the middle of New York City, and you'll find a dozen tin pot dictators all over the world just clamoring to take responsibility and begging to be smart-bombed.
I can't believe it. This is about increasing arms sales.
In September of 2000, a neoconservative think tank called the Project for a New American Century echoed Brzezinski's statements, saying the United States is the world's only superpower, combining preeminent military power, global technological leadership, and the world's largest economy. An engine for New World Order ideals, members of PNAC included Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, Jeb Bush, Scooter Libby, William Kristol, and Paul Wolfowitz.
It's a faction. A small faction.
For what possible gain?
Describing the difficulty in projecting force, they write the process of transformation is likely to be a long one, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event, like a new Pearl Harbor.
Treason. The cabal of neoconservatives at PNAC, I think you all know what that is, who planned this war, Cheney, Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz, Libby, Pearl.
They were referred to as the crazies.
This cabal knew the American people would not stand for a war against Iraq unless there was, as they put it in their own document, a new Pearl Harbor.
And lo and behold, there came 9/11. What a gift. What a gift. They actually said this before 9/11. Barring a, quote, new Pearl Harbor event, we won't be able to get the stupid people to do what we want to do. Because the stupid people won't support us when our bloodthirsty wars and going and killing a bunch of people so we can secure the energy reserves. They won't support it. And they're right. They wouldn't support it.
People are jumping out the windows. Over there, they're jumping out.
Confused between the fear of an unknown enemy
A terrorist attack.
and an ill-repressed thirst for revenge,
Terrorist pig.
Americans flatly accepted a war, the invasion of Afghanistan, that had already been planned to the smallest detail.
Our grief has turned to anger, and anger to resolution. Whether we bring our enemies to justice or bring justice to our enemies, justice will be done.
Immediately, George W. Bush declared war on terrorism.
Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts.
The lies. The biggest one in modern history, 9/11. What a farce.
19 hijackers of the planes that crashed into the World Trade Center towers, into the Pentagon, and into the rural area in Pennsylvania.
Seen from up close, the official version soon started to show some serious weaknesses. Too many curious events, too many inconsistencies, too many coincidences pointed at the possibility that the truth had been somewhat different from what we had been told. This set off an unprecedented investigation on the internet. Thousands of independent researchers from all over the world ended up bringing to light so many faults in the official version that it legitimized suspicion that the U.S. administration had some kind of role in the attacks. From flight amateurs who perform highly acrobatic maneuvers without ever having piloted a jet in their life, to passports, personal wills, and terrorists' bandanas conveniently emerging from a hole where the plane cannot be found. From an entire Boeing 757 disappearing in a 15-foot wide hole, to modern steel buildings collapsing against the most fundamental laws of physics. It has become very difficult today to maintain that the official version reflects what truly happened on that day. In fact, in 2006, almost half of Americans believe that the Bush administration covered up the truth about 9/11. And the protests of those requesting a new, truly independent investigation keep increasing by the day.
How incredible is it that anyone in their right mind would buy this ridiculous version that all these so-called experts in the mainstream media are telling us, that Osama bin Laden and 19 hijackers, 5 of which are verified to be alive to this day, that these guys were responsible for this act, including Mohammed Atta. Who knows Mohammed Atta, who he is?
Atta, Mohammed Atta, leader of Al-Qaeda's 9/11 hijackings. From Prague comes a Czech intelligence report of a photograph allegedly showing Mohammed Atta meeting with a high-ranking Iraqi intelligence officer.
The lead hijacker of 9/11, supposedly. Mohammed Atta, this is not me making this up, this is a fact. Mohammed Atta was snorting cocaine and drinking booze in strip joints in Florida.
There was always drinking, always drinking. There wasn't wine, it was beer or liquor or whatever. There was always drinking, always. And they had massive supplies of cocaine. Muhammad and all these people that he was with, they were drunk and stoned out of their freaking minds.
That's Mohammed Atta, the lead hijacker. One day snorting cocaine and drinking booze and having sex with strippers. The next day flying a jihadic mission. Are you serious? Is this some sort of bad movie? Is this serious? And what does it say about us? That we could believe for 1 second this ridiculous version of what happened on 9/11.
The government has lied about 9/11 repeatedly and used it to dominate the Middle East, while creating an evolving police state here, encroaching on civil liberties at home. And of course, building a new world order.
There is a chance for the President of the United States to use this disaster to carry out what his father, a phrase his father used, I think, only once, and hasn't been used since, and that is a new world order.
We know now that September 11th of 2001 was the beginning of what we might call a new world order.
The first building hit at high floor by the first plane is in smoke.
On September 11, 2001, American network television relays the U.S. government's immediate finger-pointing at Osama bin Laden and the Afghan Taliban.
We all know perfectly well that the Taliban has been housing and comforting Osama bin Laden.
The Taliban have been warned. The U.S. is going to retaliate against Afghanistan itself.
We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them.
Even though the alleged terrorist list doesn't include any Afghans, President Bush consults neither the U.S. Congress nor the United Nations and attacks Afghanistan within a month of September 11th.
Certainly the U.S. has been involved in many acts of indiscriminate bombing and killing and targeting of Afghans. that has created enormous resentment, especially immediately after the war when they were trying to hunt down bin Laden. There were enormous bombing incidents which I think were completely inappropriate to the target, given that you were aiming to bomb maybe a few Taliban, but you were using these enormous munitions, killing a lot of civilians.
More innocent civilians have died in Afghanistan as a result of high-altitude bombing by the United States Air Force than died in the September 11th attacks in New York. We need to keep these things in mind.
Their war has lasted a decade now and has brought Afghanistan to all but complete ruin. Not only is the nation's infrastructure and economy destroyed, its people too have been rendered little more than collateral. They have been targeted as sport, burnt, raped, arrested, and mistreated.
A year ago yesterday, on November 6, 2012, tens of millions of Americans went to the polls to re-elect President Obama. On that same day, thousands of miles away, a 39-year-old Afghan farmer named Mohammed Qasim disappeared after being arrested by U.S. Special Forces. He was never heard from again. Months later, an Afghan shepherd saw a feral dog digging at human remains now believed to be the farmer's. His decaying body was found just outside a base used by a team of U.S. Special Forces known as the A-Team. The body was found just weeks after U.S. Special Forces were compelled by the Afghan government to leave the base amid allegations of torture and murder. More and more bodies were soon found just outside the base located in Wardak province west of Kabul. In total, Afghan officials say they have uncovered the bodies of 10 Afghan men, all of whom disappeared after being arrested by U.S. Special Forces.
Many Afghans have experienced firsthand the West's empty rhetoric about human rights and freedom in the prisons of Bagram and Kandahar.
چې ډیر وخت وروسته بیا د خلک په زړه کې بدوالی رامنځته کړي چې امریکایان چې دي دوی دهشتګرد دي، دوی د شپې په خلکو باندې حملې کوي، هغه سره ظلم شوي، هغه انتقام اخلي.
This is the US military's brand new $60 million detention center at Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan. It will replace the former notorious prison, a symbol of detainee abuse for Afghans following the death of 2 inmates in 2002.
The prisoners who will soon be moved here remain in legal limbo. They haven't been charged with any crime. No civilian lawyer has ever been allowed inside Bagram.
Abdul Raqib's case was one that is unfortunately very typical of the types of injustice that you see that are ongoing in Afghanistan right now. His story is an all too familiar one because there are literally hundreds of families of individuals who have come forward to complain that their sons are being held without legal justification by the United States government.
Wazir Muhammad is a Kabul taxi driver who disappeared into Bagram in April last year. He's now in Guantanamo Bay. He's not been charged with anything. His crime was to inquire after a friend, another taxi driver, who was arrested and who has since been released. What makes this case so appalling is that this man is recognized by the present government as having resisted the Taliban. This is his brother, Taj Muhammad, a nurse. This is where he is now, Guantanamo Bay, where prisoners are shackled, trussed, and kept in cages 8 feet by 7 feet for up to 24 hours a day. The light is always on. Children and old men have been incarcerated. Amnesty International calls it a black hole, a violation of the most basic human rights. There are 9 British citizens here, including this man, Shafiq Rasool from the West Midlands, who was effectively kidnapped by the Americans 2 weeks after he'd arrived in Pakistan, where he has relatives. That was almost 2 years ago. Since then, his family has pleaded for help from the British government, but still, he's been charged with nothing.
America and Afghanistan are now allies against terror.
As the next step of the so-called Operation Enduring Freedom, the U.S. government installs Afghanistan's new president, former UNICAL consultant Hamid Karzai.
Chairman Hamid Karzai.
Three years later, despite promises made by the U.S. government of liberating and improving the country, the situation in Afghanistan is still as precarious as before.
We're trying to build the infrastructure within Afghanistan. We're trying to create the conditions that will enable security and prosperity to take hold in this country.
Well, you know, we should understand that only the first road, the Kabul-Kandahar highway, has been rebuilt in Afghanistan and was opened only in December 2003, which means that 2.5 years have passed since 9/11, over which very little work has been done.
Only, by the way, 24 to 25% of the population in Afghanistan have access to safe water, and about 12 to 13% of the population have access to adequate sanitation. And the needs include essential medicines and drugs, childhood diseases, tuberculosis, malnutrition, water and sanitation, and community health. But we are implementing the programs ourselves. This is not the case in other countries.
I think that it's clear one of the main reasons that America went into Afghanistan was to try and get Al-Qaeda dismantled, the organization which committed the 9/11 atrocity.
Really?
Well, you don't think so?
Well, how come Al-Qaeda put the heroin business out? They took all the poppy growers and stopped the production of heroin.
What would you have done?
Wait, now how much of that illegal heroin was propping up the international banks with laundered money, and when it dried up, the first recession happened? Well, now that we're back in there, we aligned with the poppy growers, and the heroin business is back up full swing again. I thought we fight a war on drugs here.
All right, Jesse,
Seems we're not.
Afghanistan is the world's largest supplier of opium, and since the US invasion in 2002, the growing of opium poppies has reached staggering proportions, with money from the British government being used by opium farmers to plant gigantic fields of poppies. The BBC confirmed in April 2004 that since the invasion and occupation of Afghanistan by British and American forces, poppy production has reached an all-time high.
Opium poppies, eradicated by the Taliban as part of their proclaimed moral order, have been reintroduced by the Northern Alliance warlords. In 2003, with a mighty 3/4 of the world production, Afghanistan has become the world's #1 producer of heroin.
All the warlords are deeply involved, either in selling or trafficking in opium oil, or actually in providing resources for farmers to grow it. The Americans have not done anything. Neither the coalition forces nor the NATO-led peacekeeping forces, and nor has President Karzai.
It was revealed in October of 2009 that the CIA had been funding puppet Afghani leader Hamid Karzai's warlord brother for the last 8 years. He is the lead opium dealer in the region. It seems the same cartel that was dealing drugs in the 80s and 90s never stopped. After all, how else could the government fund black operations programs across the board?
The Karzai regime has whole sections of it which are drug supported, and we can't touch it. We turned Afghanistan into the major supplier of heroin for the world. It happened under CIA supervision.
They control the legal and illegal drug trades, and in cases like the Iran-Contra scandal, the American government itself was caught supplying its country with cocaine.
Essentially, black operations were not only caught dealing arms illegally and supporting South American dictators, but also smuggling drugs into the United States.
Iran-Contra was really the merging of two different programs. The first one was support for the Contras, who were, let's face it, a force of terrorists in Nicaragua trying to overthrow the Sandinista government. They were being secretly supported by the CIA, and at the bottom of the whole thing was drugs.
Iran-Contra was openly exposed by massive network coverage.
How was it that in 3 years, a network Washington set up to run arms to the Contras wound up running cocaine into this country for the most vicious drug cartel in the world? At the same time, we were supposed to be fighting a war against drugs.
But by the same token, I also smuggle my share of weapons in exchange for those illegal substances, with the full knowledge and assistance of both the DEA and CIA.
Betzner says that in 1983, he flew weapons from Florida to El Salvador and drugs from Colombia to the Bahamas on the way back. In 1984, he says, he flew twice from Florida to Costa Rica and back.
We could bring back our own cargo, and they would arrange it, or we could bring back their cargo without ever having to worry about interception, arrest, anything like this, that everything was taken care of.
What kind of cargo were you talking about?
Drugs.
I will tell you, Director Deutsch, as a former Los Angeles police narcotics detective, that the agency has dealt drugs throughout this country for a long time. Director Deutsch, I will refer you to 3 specific agency operations known as Amadeus, Pegasus, and Watchtower. I have Watchtower documents heavily redacted by the agency. I was personally exposed to CIA operations and recruited by CIA personnel who attempted to recruit me in the late 70s to become involved in protecting agency drug operations in this country. I have been trying to get this out for 18 years, and I have the evidence. If you have information about CIA illegal activity in drugs, you should immediately bring that information to wherever you want, but let me suggest 3 places. The Los Angeles Police Department, for the record, my name is Mike Rupert, R-U-P-P-E-R-T. I did bring this information out 18 years ago, and I got shot at and forced out of LAPD because of it. I've been on the record for 18 years, nonstop, and I'll be happy to give you, Congressman, anything that I have.
Thank you, Mr. Rupert.
The narrative on this war that we are fed from politicians and media presupposes positive intentions on the part of the United States and her allies. Yet the history of their foreign policy belies any sincerity or positive intent for others. They know only of their own selfish economic and political interests and are willing to destroy entire nations to achieve this. In the Muslim world in particular, Western foreign policy has been brutal and unrelenting. A mix of propping up dictators, establishing foreign entities, and displacing entire peoples, going to war based on lies, and pursuing policies designed to create and embed division and chaos. Hence, not only is the war in Afghanistan a costly, unjust, and oppressive failure, it is also being waged by those who have no regard for human beings, their lives, and livelihoods.
My fellow citizens, at this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger. Our nation enters this conflict reluctantly, yet our purpose is sure.
These are the oil fields of the Middle East, the greatest prize of all. Iraq is the world's second biggest oil producer, and its conquest gives America a vast base from which to dominate the Middle East. It's been a conquest achieved at any price, including truth.
I joined in 03 because I was broke, I needed money, but I was a young American kid, I wanted to fight in the war. I joined up, month out of training, I arrive in Baghdad, Iraq, January 04. Saddam's been captured. And I get there, and the guys that I'm serving with have been there for 6 months already. They were there in 03. And I go, well, you know, I think it's come out that, you know, these people had nothing to do with 9/11. There was no Iraqi on those planes. We can see around here there's no Al-Qaeda, there's no terrorist syndicates in Baghdad or Iraq. Saddam had stamped them out. And I asked my buddies, well, you know, we're here to find weapons of mass destruction. And they laughed at me. And I said, well, you know, we're here to help the people. And they laughed at me. And I said, well, what's our mission? What's our goal? I thought we were going to find the people that did 9/11. I thought we were going to get these weapons of mass destruction. I thought we were going to help the people. And they're like, all we're trying to do is make it home alive.
It was serious dishonesty, the result of which includes the fact that thousands of Iraqis have died. Hundreds of soldiers from our own countries have tragically died.
Andrew Wilkie is the only serving Western intelligence officer to break cover and expose what he believes to be the truth about the invasion of Iraq. Working in the top-secret Office of National Assessments in Canberra, he saw intelligence shared by America, Britain and Australia.
We were sold this war on the basis of Iraq possessing a massive arsenal of weapons of mass destruction, which was never found and won't be found because there was no massive arsenal of weapons. We were also promised a need for a war on the basis of active cooperation between Iraq and Al-Qaeda, and the fact that it was just a matter of time before some of these weapons from this massive arsenal were passed to this terrorist group. Always a ridiculous proposition, and always completely at odds with my experience in the intelligence community that there was no hard intelligence to establish that there was a link between Iraq and Al-Qaeda.
You know, I never saw any evidence that would link it, and thus far there's been no evidence produced that would suggest that Saddam was behind Al-Qaeda. In fact, my experience in the time I served would suggest the opposite, that Saddam was the least likely person to want anything to do with Al-Qaeda.
Meeting notes from the afternoon of 9/11 show Donald Rumsfeld tasking a top aide to find the best info fast, good enough to hit Saddam Hussein. He asks the aide to get evidence from Wolfowitz of a Saddam connection with UBL, Osama bin Laden.
We all looked at each other like, what are they talking about? Who the hell? Saddam Hussein? Bin Laden hates him, thinks he's a heretic. There's no connection between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda.
The word goes out to the CIA, FBI, and all the intelligence services. Find the connection.
The war on terror involves Saddam Hussein because of Al-Qaeda connections, because of his history. He's a danger to the American people. And we got to deal with him. We've got to deal with him before it is too late.
They thought, when September 11th happened, perfect, great opportunity, a great excuse. If we can tell the American people that this is part of the war on terrorism, that this is somehow linked to Al-Qaeda, that Saddam has nuclear weapons, then they felt they could actually manipulate the American people, their grief, their suffering, their anger in such a way to carry out something that they had been planning since 1997. And it was a perfect pretext for them, but it had nothing to do with the reality of September 11th and nothing to do with the reality of their own assertions, all of which have proved to be complete lies.
Now, 3,000 Americans are dead. We don't care how many Iraqis you got to kill. Killing the civilians is part of war. And that's what they sent us into Baghdad with.
The justification would be, oh, we were attacked on 9/11, therefore we have a right, based on the UN Charter's provisions for self-defense, to kill anyone, anywhere in the world, anytime, as long as we argue that they are linked to that initial attack, which may be years ago.
We should keep in mind that CNN, which many believe to be a liberal network, had a memo from their top news executive, Walter Isaacson, in the fall of 2001, as the missiles were falling in Afghanistan, telling the anchors and the reporters, you need to remind people, anytime you show images on the screen of the people who were dying in Afghanistan, you've got to remind the American viewers that it's in the context of what happened on 9/11, as though people could forget 9/11.
Where we talked to several people who told us that various friends and relatives had died in the bombing there, in that collateral damage. Nick Robertson, CNN, Kandahar, Afghanistan.
And we would just remind you, as we always do now with these reports from inside the Taliban-controlled Afghanistan, that you're seeing only one side of the story, that these U.S. military actions that Nick Robertson was talking about are in response to a terrorist attack that killed 5,000 and more innocent people inside the United States.
Kandahar, and we juxtapose what we're hearing from the Taliban with a live picture of the cleanup that continues in Lower Manhattan. Ground Zero, again, a 24-hour operation that has not ebbed. 5,000 killed that day back on Tuesday, September 11th, their biggest crime, as civilians going to work that day.
And yet, we know statistically, the best estimates tell us, that more civilians were killed by that bombing in Afghanistan than those who died in the Twin Towers in New York. And the moral objections that could be raised to slaughtering civilians in the name of retaliation against 9/11, those objections were muted by the phrase war on terror, by the way in which it was used by the White House and Congress, and also by the news media.
Now that's what we call a carte blanche. In other words, it's an open invitation to kill worldwide, anywhere, anyone. That's a precedent which is extraordinarily dangerous to the civilized international community.
We don't really give a damn what anybody thinks. We rub everyone's face in it. We're Americans and you're not, and we're talking the Roman Empire here. I mean, we'll do anything we want to do, anywhere we want to do it, and you're either with us or against us, and multilateral institutions like the UN are incidental and irrelevant to the powers that be. That is the image we're sending to the world. That is what much of the world feels about this country right this minute.
Good evening. Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack. America was targeted for attack because we're the brightest beacon for evil and the very worst of human nature. I've directed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to find those who want peace and security in the world and to bring them to justice. We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and the victims of the American economy. Our military is evil and it's prepared. Our country is evil, deliberate and deadly evil. All that is evil, comforted by evil, and no one will keep that evil from shining. And we stand together to win the war against all that is good and just. None of us will ever find those responsible. Thank you. Good night.